I don't think there's been a game I was more conflicted about than Fantasian Neo Dimension. In part, I think that's because Fantasian seems conflicted itself on what it wants to be. The game was originally split into Part 1 and Part 2, and you can absolutely see that divide in the game even with the two parts together. I can see some people absolutely adoring Fantasian, and some people will not even want to finish. You know how I know that? Because I felt both feelings while playing through the game myself. Fantasian Neo Dimension is an RPG developed by Mistwalker and published by Square Enix. The initial release was for the Apple Arcade back in 2021, and that one was published by Mistwalker themselves. The Apple Arcade release was split into two parts. Part 1 released on April 1st, 2021, and Part 2 on August 13th, 2021. This two-part model is going to be important to remember because there are differences between them beyond just the release date. For several years, that mobile release remained the only way to play Fantasian until the announcement of Fantasian Neo Dimension, an updated re-release that would be coming to many other platforms. Fantasian Neo Dimension added in HD graphics, voice acting, some gameplay adjustments, and a recent patch even added some variable difficulty for second playthroughs. Neo Dimension was brought about by partnering with Square Enix, the former employer of Fantasian's designer, producer, and writer Hironobu Sakaguchi, who created the Final Fantasy series. Fantasian Neo Dimension came out for PS4, PS5, PC, Switch, and the Xbox Series on December 5th, 2024. Reception to the game has been positive, with particular emphasis on creative gameplay. The critique the game has received has generally centered around a basic narrative and the sudden difficulty spike in Part 2. These are points that I generally agree with, so let's get into the specifics of what Fantasian is and what this new release specifically has to offer. Fantasian Neo Dimension takes place in a land facing an infestation called Macteria taking over the world. Nothing has been found that can stop this advance since it came through the wormhole, but that doesn't mean there aren't people trying to find a way. Enter our protagonist Leo, an amnesiac who we first encounter in another land full of robots and machines before being transported back to the human realm. From there, in order to get his memories back, he connects with a girl named Kina, and they start a journey that will hopefully help Leo find his memories, Kina her destiny, and the whole world a solution to defeating the Macteria. One name keeps coming up as they explore around though: Vam. How does he connect to this? All of that and more our heroes will discover on their journey. The story starts off very simple, perhaps too simple in some cases, as character motivations take a little while to solidify and help establish strong character dynamics between the cast. The story is likely one that will be familiar to those who have played RPGs before. The saving grace for the story to me is the interesting world in which the game is set, and Part 2 taking the time to delve further into backstory and motivation. It's just too bad that couldn't be the case in Part 1 when the characters feel somewhat flat. I like when games take the time to really focus in and develop a character and a storyline, and again, Part 2 does that quite well, aided by the voice acting. Not sure how the game feels without that addition. In some ways, Part 1 feels like an overly long prologue, which is unfortunate in your efforts to capture and retain your audience. Is there a reward at the end of the rainbow? Yes, but it is hard to build on a fairly bare foundation. Oh, and also a slight tangent, I am very fond of the site How Long to Beat. It really helps me plan my gaming schedule, but sometimes it can be deceptive. How Long to Beat users claim they are beating the main story and just the main story in an average of 22.5 hours. This is a lie. Speaking as someone who didn't do a lot of side content and I'm sitting at over 45 hours in the game, maybe for Part 1 they would be correct, but not the whole game. Just warning you folks. The saving grace for Fantasian for a lot of people comes with the gameplay, which while it also starts simple in Part 1 is also quite fun. You have up to 3 party members in battle with various different abilities to use. Not only do you have different elements for the abilities to exploit enemy weaknesses, but you also have different ability trajectories. Some abilities you can curve to hit multiple enemies or hit around an enemy. Some abilities hit a range on the battlefield. Others can go through a set of enemies, and then you have the ones that hit the first thing they see, but hit it hard. This leads to not just depth and strategy in your thinking, but creativity in the enemy and boss design to take advantage of this unique mechanic. Beyond that, it is fairly standard with your characters having various buffs and debuffs, abilities that cause status effects, as well as heals and shields. Likewise, the enemies have much the same arsenal to throw at you, although the bosses tend to have abilities that can do multiple of said things at once. You can then respond with your own super move, but only in part 2. With a high encounter rate, you'd think the gameplay could get tedious, but the Dimension allows you to take enemies you have faced before and put them elsewhere until you are ready to face them, or it gets too full. I think this helped with the pacing and allowed me to explore freely through areas I'd already been before. I do think an option to control the encounter rate would have been more useful, but if a game doesn't want to go that far, then the Dimension is a creative alternative. The gameplay in its regular formula is a lot of fun. The main drawback to the game is in the difficulty balancing. In part 1, field enemies are a breeze, and bosses usually don't take more than twice to beat, so long as you're not doing something extremely wrong. As noted in the reviews though, part 2 represents a severe climb in difficulty. The field enemies are now properly challenging. That's okay. The bosses though, crank the dial from easy to nightmare without pausing in between to give you a chance to breathe. This challenge isn't inherently a bad thing. In fact, some of those boss battles are a tense, rewarding fight that I had a great time with. Unfortunately, there are a couple things still wrong with this picture. One is how steep the difficulty climb is. People come into certain games expecting certain levels of difficulty, especially when you reinforce it through, I don't know, let's say the entire first half of the game. A gradual difficulty climb would help players adjust to later challenges. That's not what Fantasian does. I think this, more than any other part of the game, would persuade players to drop it, but you'd think once you mastered the new system, new additions, and you've adjusted, you'd be in the clear. Not so. The difficulty doesn't stop climbing from there. On top of that, a significant portion of the later bosses run into what I call the my way or the highway situation, in which a boss has pretty much one dominant strategy to beat it. You find it, you win. Only other way is to grind up those levels way above the recommended, which the game actively discourages you to do by slashing your experience if you are fighting enemies below your current level. Do you see some of the problems here? Fantasian has some great ideas, but the execution of them, in part because of Apple's successful persuading of Mistwalker to make the game into 2 parts, is an active detriment to the game in multiple ways. Variable difficulty, which was added for Neo Dimension, would alleviate so many of these issues, however they restrict it to New Game Plus. Another thing that complicates but also improves Part 2 is the growth map. This is where you'll be able to improve stats, unlock new abilities, and improve current abilities, and it is essential. There are some incredibly powerful abilities, but one of the twists of the formula is that there are items that you will need to collect from treasure chests that unlock portions of the growth map. You can also unlock a chance to improve certain weapons and armor with items you collect. I like the ideas for all of these, but much like the difficulty and story, the distinction between Part 1 and Part 2 causes a disjointed feeling between the game. I simply wish these options were there from the start. Fantasian also has plenty of side quests and collecting that you can do, from the Cinderella Tri-Stars to collecting all the cats. There is plenty to do that will help extend your playtime if that's what you wanted, of course. I do recommend engaging with a lot of the side content because that's where you're going to get your most powerful weapons and armor, and these are good to have if you want to give yourself the best advantages you can to beat the later bosses. As for presentation, the highlight is the dioramas that were created to serve this world. Each one of them is so intricately put together and is a lot of fun to explore around. It gives Fantasian as a game and the worlds it creates a feeling unique to any other game I've played. The cutscenes are well animated and fit almost seamlessly into the game despite the change of graphical style. The character designs are good as well, with clear personality and charm put into each of the characters, even if most of them fit established character types. Now, all respect to Nobuo Uematsu, but Fantasian is not what I would call his strongest work. The highlights are actually the area themes and the character themes. The battle themes suffer from feeling overly repetitive, especially the main one. The boss battle themes did tend to be better than the regular battle themes, and Neo Dimension offers the chance to change the battle music to Final Fantasy themes if you wanted, which was a nice addition. For a game as long as this one, having more variety in the soundtrack though would have benefited the game overall. The voice acting definitely enhanced the game and overall story, but I do think that once again, with a Square Enix game, the voice direction left much to be desired. A lot of line deliveries ended up very flat compared to the events that were happening, and so the impact was not felt as keenly as it could have been. Due to the game originally being a mobile release, the UI and UX are very clear and easy to navigate. There's even some nice setting adjustments you can do to make the experience smoother for players like me who insist on mouse and keyboard in nearly all situations. Fantasian Neo Dimension has a distinctive presentation that does have some notable flaws, but overall accomplishes the job well. My overall thoughts on Fantasian Neo Dimension is that it feels like two games put into one. The first game was a nice introduction with some simple ideas and a straightforward story, and then fans said it was too easy, so for the second game the devs ramped up the difficulty along with the complexity of the gameplay and story. If it were two games, this would probably not be as much of a bother, but since it is one, I felt the change more jarringly. Fantasian will always have its ardent fans, and I wish I could join them wholeheartedly, but there's simply a lot that does not work as well for me. If after all this, the game still seems appealing, then I encourage you to give this a try, but I feel it would be disingenuous to pretend like the issues I had with the game didn't exist even for the sake of my normally very positive videos. Thank you to Square Enix for the code to cover the game. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video, subscribe for more in the future, and comment below your thoughts on Fantasian Neo Dimension. Have a great day, and happy gaming!